everybody, my name is Luke Mar and this is Hotline Mode, and today on Hotline Mode we are doing another fashion history video. I apologize it's taken a while, but we're going to continue on our little historical journey through the House of Dior, and we're going to be talking about the third creative director to actually work for the brand, who was Marc Bohan. So let's get into this history of Dior. Now, following the apparent downfall of Yves Saint Laurent, both in psyche and in career, after he was forced to depart from the House of Dior, another man who some might say was more stable in mental capacity, age, and experience was given the key to one of the most powerful fashion brands in the world. And that man was Marc Bohan. Marc Bohan was originally born Roger Maurice Louis Bohan on August 22nd, 1926, near the outskirts of Paris. His mother was a hat maker while his father was a mechanic. As a child, he particularly enjoyed being around his godmother, who spoiled him and allowed him to read her fashion magazines. He graduated from school and began to work in finance, not exactly what he wanted, but it did allow for financial security. Now, during his lunch breaks, while he worked at a bank that his family had helped set up for him, he would stroll along the streets of Paris looking at the big couture houses from Pekin to Schiaparelli. And after World War II, he left the bank he'd worked at and began to work under Jean Pateau's label. But after only 9 months at Pateau, he moved on to Peugeot, which was the apple of his eye. Here, though, he was not the only Roger, for the head of finance for the company's name was Roger, and he and their messages were always getting mixed up. So Peugeot himself said that something had to be done to remedy this internal situation. So Roger decided to rename himself as Marc Bohan. Marc is not an easy name for the French, and especially at that time it really wasn't. But it did stick. Peugeot was good for Marc though, as it pushed him to be more well-rounded in terms of working for a couturier. He had to do sketches, offer new ideas, and constantly rework them. He and Hubert de Givenchy actually worked together at that time and even presented a look together that was included in one of the shows under Peugeot's name, and it helped gain both of them some notoriety from the press. After a while, he left Peugeot to begin his military service, but was let go as he was his family's main breadwinner. And from there, he was offered the chance to design under his own name. And so he did. He had press following his journey, and he had a small studio space as well. The collection that he debuted was undoubtedly inspired by Dior's new look, which was at the height of popularity at that time in 1953. After Bohan's company failed though, for a lack of money, Bohan's friends and acquaintances suggested he go work for Dior himself. One day, they were introduced in April of 1957, and Dior liked him and suggested he come and work for him. He was going to become the head of the New York branch of Dior, as Dior had scaled his business far and wide at this point. But Monsieur Dior died, and the contract that was being drawn up had been postponed. The young, dumb, and full of cum Yves Saint Laurent had been deemed the new creative director, and a change of plans forced Bohan to become the head of the London branch instead. Bohan was going about shaking up the clothing for the British clientele of Dior. But Marc didn't really want to be second fiddle at such a big brand, so he was looking to leave the company. But after Yves Saint Laurent was sent off for military service, Marcel Boussac, who had been annoyed with YSL's experimental style that upset both press and clients, remembered that Dior had thought highly of Bohan and asked him if he would become the next creative director. You can find more about Yves Saint Laurent's experience at Dior here. Bohan, after the failure of his own brand though, was much happier to have an already established brand to somewhat hide behind. So on September 28th, 1960, Marc Bohan was appointed the creative director of Christian Dior. Bohan, who came into the creative directorship at Dior at the very beginning of the 1960s, didn't immediately start to create pieces that reflected the upcoming decade. Instead, he utilized the traditional aspects of couture to create looks that were wearable, yet had a high fashion and couture flair. The looks weren't boring, yet they also weren't revolutionary, which the press found to be an added string to his bow. And clients also found it more approachable in terms of how they would go about purchasing it. Bohan seemed to have learned from his predecessor Yves Saint Laurent that his boss Marcel Boussac felt that cutting-edge designs cut into the company's bottom line. Bohan had much more experience working in a plethora of couture houses, so being able to create breathtaking looks with the same old techniques was not something that posed a problem. Marc had worked under Peugeot like Dior, and utilized the same references as Dior. He also was 34 upon his appointment, so he didn't have the same need to target a younger customer like the 21-year-old Yves Saint Laurent did. While YSL's collections pushed boundaries and were necessary, Bohan had a steady hand that would guide the brand for 30 years to come. The best way to describe Marc Bohan as the designer of Dior would be as a chameleon. He evolved through 3 different decades: the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s. And we will be taking these Dior decades apart, so let's start with the 1960s. The 1960s was a time of great change for Western culture. The Youthquake, as it was called, took hold of the West and broke down class, race, gender, and sexual barriers. And Marc Bohan's first collection for Dior, titled The Slim Look, helped to illustrate that. The collection was heralded by the press with reports of chairs being toppled over after the show had ended, and Bohan being mauled with kisses and hugs. The collection referenced the late 1920s, which was the reason the clothing was so streamlined, which essentially meant they had an ease of movement to them. The 1920s was all about loose clothing that didn't hug the body, hence looks that were a bit more masculine compared to Christian Dior's own new look, which was all about being shorter, freer, and flirtier. The clothing is quite demure, usually monochromatic, and utilizes a range of fabrics from flannel to wool to linen. What really made this collection stand out was the use of the Bohan flare. This was a term invented to describe how Bohan's use of a flare cut for both skirts and dresses was well received, and something that went on to influence fashion throughout the world. Even from his earliest collections, Bohan seemed to have this quite youthful take on clothing. There were shorter A-line silhouettes, which were quite boxy, even when they were trying to flatter the body. Apparently, the Slim Look collection had actually been a small ode to the First Lady of the United States at the time, who was Jackie Kennedy. She was even photographed wearing a coat titled Vie en Rose, which was done in a pale pink linen. Sorry for all the French people, you already know the pronunciation shit, but like, yeah, apologies. Jackie, after a certain point, had to stop wearing French designers, all of them, as it was unbecoming of an American First Lady to only wear French haute couture. But she did have quite the fondness for Bohan, and that didn't stop her personal stylist and designer Oleg Cassini from making a few Dior copies in his day. And speaking of copying, the Slim Look collection in fact caused a bit of a stir, but not for the reason you would think. In 1961, the Soviet Union hosted a gala evening for the Moscow Film Festival and invited well-known actors and actresses. In attendance was the icon Elizabeth Taylor, wearing a Miss Dior evening dress in ivory organdy, which was embroidered with lilies of the valley flowers. If you had forgotten, that was Christian Dior's favorite flower, and both Bohan and Saint Laurent paid homage through the botanical beauty. Well, another famous actress, Gina Lollobrigida, an Italian superstar in her own right, showed up wearing the same dress, but instead of a blue sash like Miss Taylor's, she showed up in a red one. The Dior ateliers kept extensive records of all their clients' purchases, so things like this didn't happen, because in reality it's quite embarrassing. But unfortunately, it made front page news around the world, which would also mean that one of the dresses was faked, or at least made without the knowledge of Dior itself. Bohan did eventually confirm that he had made the dress for Miss Taylor, which would have meant that Lollobrigida would have had a copy of the dress made, resulting in a big fashion faux pas. In reality, it garnered great press, and Marcel Boussac didn't mind it, I'm sure. There also is a now famous photo of Bohan with his muses wearing dresses from the Slim Look collection, and each of the dresses was named after different gardens. From left to right, they are Jardin d'Ardely, Jardin de Paris, Jardin d'Espagne, and Jardin Anglaise. Thank you. Bohan's love of florals and nature as inspiration is so on par with Christian Dior himself. And honestly, he really does feel like the true successor to the brand, especially in this photo. Another famous photo of repeat customer Elizabeth Taylor has her in a long bubble dress with a bodice in green silk chiffon and a skirt of ivory silk fille embroidered with florals. It's so crisp and clean, yet had such an old world flair that would have probably been quite chic and modern at the time. And to end most couture collections is obviously a wedding dress, and Bohan's first was absolutely royal. The look was called hyménie, meaning marriage in French, not to be confused with the hymen. I know all of you, you're perverts like me. It was a white hood and gown that created an ethereal presence with the model holding long white rosary beads. While only her bangs and face can be seen, the silhouette of her torso shines through the fabric, creating a radiant effect. Before we continue talking about Bohan's collections, you need to understand that there aren't too many collections that are extremely noteworthy like Yves Saint Laurent's work. I mean, listen, he was only there for like 4 years, so it's just a different kind of style. Bohan worked at the house for 29 years, and he didn't do that through shock and awe that had gotten YSL fired quite quickly. He instead glided through styles and trends and reinvented them in a high-class and haute couture setting that was fresh and new for his clients. In reality, not ruffling any feathers is actually quite helpful for fashion designers trying to keep their jobs. I mean, look at Maria Grazia's work. So as we talk about Bohan's work from here on out, we will, like Bohan, glide through his collections noting noteworthy things, but unlike some of the geniuses of fashion, Bohan was not necessarily revolutionary. He was more about security. Next up was his Charm 62 collection, which was another commercial success. You'll notice that commercial success is a pattern Bohan liked to follow. This collection continued using the Bohan flair, like this look titled Gamine, which means child in French. The look is quite utilitarian, as it can be worn quite conservatively, all buttoned up with gloves and hat to match, but also can be young and fresh and free like in this Marc Shaw image. I will also say Bohan's real charm lies within the details of his work. This pink moire gown and this ivory garbadine dress both have this wraparound button style top. The moire look is a bit flashier, but in reality, the elements are extremely interesting and quite modern even today. The final look from the collection we will discuss is this beautiful yellow silk fly gown that has a waist of embroidered pearls and jewels. It is fucking fantastic, and I don't even normally enjoy this kind of work, but holy shit, this is haute couture. The jewelry detail around the waist is dripping with little crystals in yellow and white, pearl drop pearls, and swags of pearls. This work is all layered on top of a layer of tiny beads in yellow that perfectly accent the crop bodice and voluminous skirt of silk fly. The devil is in the details with this man. For the spring-summer 1962 titled The Arrow line, it was based on a collection developed originally by Christian Dior himself. Dior's Arrow collection, which was a follow-up to his Y line, and explored a high waist and arrow-like armholes. Bohan's collection was more modern for the time and also played on the new and fun activity of flying. The 1960s was a great time for air travel, and it was treated as an activity and less of a chore as it is now. Women would often wear their best outfits, and many of them, I assume, would be wearing haute couture. So Bohan creating a collection to outfit the rich who take planes in a collection revolving around the rich who take planes is kind of meta, no? I also could just be confusing myself at this point, I'm unsure. This Arrow line created beautiful looks like this gorgeous onyx evening dress with black beads that created a crackle effect that stemmed from the center of the waist. The collection was quite diverse as it was meant to dress women jet-setting all over the globe. So you have dresses like this gray silk tulle gown embroidered with glass beads called the Soirée à Versailles, and this embroidered pink tulle dress with a ravishing bust called the Soirée à Bangkok. Each of the dresses had names revolving around famous cities and sites, which could have been in order to drum up a fantasy for a client to buy into. There is, dare I say it, a cunty evening coat in a green velvet, which is embroidered with green beads that is so reminiscent of a peacock's tail. And if you don't see the peacock tail, then you can just see the beautiful details and artistry that went into Bohan's haute couture. The final dress we will discuss from the updated Arrow line is the pink Duchess satin gown with a beautifully embroidered bodice and pink bow. The dress was actually bought by the famed Maria Callas. Callas, for those who don't know, was a Greek-American opera singer who is said to be one of the most renowned and talented opera singers of the 20th century. You know, she does the that. Yeah, you know. She and Bohan were buddies and both loved the opera. Collis during Bohan's tenure at the company was at the height of her fame, and her ordering dresses from his collections was commonplace. Bohan would often go to Collis's performances, but the two who became friends had very different tastes in opera music. While Collis did purchase from Dior, she never commissioned looks from Bohan, and the one time she tried to, Bohan told her he couldn't, as he was quoted saying, "You cannot do these things just like that, simply because someone asks you to." He seemed to be a bit of a diva, which I like in my Dior designers. For his spring-summer 1963 collection, Bohan decided to focus on the bust, utilizing long darts to shape the body, while creating many short jackets and big hats to frame the face. One dress that was incredible from the collection was the Marbella gown. It was made from linen and was printed with florals, and from a photo you could easily assume it was just a floral motif printed on top. But Bohan's attention to detail actually brought him to create 3D flowers that jumped off the dress as you got closer to the hem. Christian Dior had created a panther printed silk for his famed New Look collection, and again used it for his 1955 collection, which had reportedly been fought over by Zizi Jeanmaire and Marlene Dietrich. But Bohan brought this style back for his autumn-winter 1963 collection by creating a large fur collar on a tweed jacket, but below the hem of the jacket, a bit of panther print peeked out, almost waiting for its prey. It most definitely dined on the fashionable crowd, as when the jacket was removed, it revealed a furry-chested panther top. Another look from the collection was a fantastic green velvet gown with a hem finished in gold thread and green jewels. Richard Avedon actually photographed the hem, as it was so exquisite with a Dior shoe that had been designed by Roger Vivier for Harper's Bazaar. In the spring-summer 1995 collection, there is a yellow silk crepe look that is pleated from top to bottom. The look was worked on by Marguerite Carré, who Bohan had known because she had worked for Jean Pateau's atelier. Now, this look to many might not mean anything, but it is incredibly important in understanding couture and how it is more a craft than anything else. Carré had developed her own way to create pleats, and often asked Christian Dior and the other subsequent designers to design looks that she in fact could work on, and that would utilize her pleating skills specifically. Couture is very unlike ready-to-wear in so many ways, but the fact that it is a collaborative effort between artists and craftsmen show how vital couture is to fashion. It's also why I respect designers like Pier Paolo Pacioli, as he is always showing the workers in his atelier and interviewing them and giving them the recognition that they deserve. For autumn-winter 1965, Bohan invented a new textile, which was a knit that had feathers embedded into the fabric. The wearer looks like her jackets are molting, but honestly, I've never seen molting look so chic. You mix that fabric with the aesthetic of the 1960s and you get a style that still feels chic today. Another interesting thing about this season was not in the collection, but rather about another wearer. Princess Grace of Monaco was a dedicated Dior customer, and while still being a princess, bought her haute couture to fit her rather than a governmental duty. She actually wore a beige check wool skirt set called the San Francisco suit to the opening of the Baby Dior boutique in 1967, 2 years after she had actually received the suit. Famed customers like Princess Grace and Elizabeth Taylor had often had custom Dior couture made for their daughters, but the brand had never officially made children's clothes. Until now. For the spring-summer 1966 collection, a tradition that was started by Christian Dior himself had changed. Looks from the collection always were given individual names, but with this couture collection that changed. While it normally helped showcase some of Dior's inspiration for the particular look, Bohan after a while felt it was becoming outdated, and that as fashion in the 1960s became all about ready-to-wear, haute couture seemed to have to follow. This collection also marked the first time that the House of Dior had ever had a hemline that rose above the knee. Note that 6 years after Yves Saint Laurent had scandalized the house and its clients, that Bohan slowly but surely rolled out looks that were similar to what the youth of that day had been wearing for years. The spring-summer 1967 collection focused on Africa and had Bohan appropriate native designs by embroidering or beading them onto column dresses or mini dresses. He even created a safari suit, which his former colleague Yves Saint Laurent took a creative swing at during the same season, although the two were very, very different. The collection also created quite vivid rainbow styles of caftans and mini dresses, which Bohan had explored earlier in his spring-summer 1966 collection, which to me was the most tacky and adventurous Bohan had been fashion-wise up to this point. Sorry, quick note. Also, in 1967, Marc Bohan literally invented the Dior monogram that we all have come to sort of hate, but also was popularized by people like John Galliano and recently Maria Grazia. So the man, in more ways than one, was so instrumental to the business acumen and heritage of Christian Dior that we know now. Bohan, during his 1967 and 1968 collections, referenced what was then known as the Orient, or the Middle East and Asia, as well as Africa. One Dior dress was shot on model Penelope Tree while she wore cornrows. It's important to recognize that the idea of appropriation in fashion is not new, but rather it has been around for at least half a century, and it's something that we must work to stop and educate ourselves on. After 1968, the upper echelons of society had changed, and women no longer were buying exquisite gowns and evening wear like they used to. So Bohan had to begin focusing on day wear and creating day wear that would easily transition into evening wear. Listen, when they say the day to night outfit, you gotta have a day to night outfit, you know what I mean? Throughout 1969, Bohan continued to dazzle with an array of distinct and different embroidered styles, from gold breastplates worn by Princess Grace of Monaco, a white organdy dress with a floral design made of rhodoid, which is a thermoplastic, which is interesting for couture. There was a design that captured the free and wild spirit of the 1960s in floral sequins and stones, and a juxtaposed black and white mini dress that used rhodoid florals to blur the separation. The 1970s assured the House of Dior that the lavish life of the 1960s was over, as Bohan from his very first collection from the decade continued to create beautiful day wear and leave the superb evening dresses behind. From the spring-summer 1970 collection, Bohan was inspired by Savile Row, the famed British street home to many a famous tailor, and where greats like Alexander McQueen and Stella McCartney apprenticed. Here, he made a beautiful suede coat that slightly flared out and was trimmed in this reptile skin, which would be the only indication at the time that this coat was in fact designed for a woman. Bohan was very much so into sportswear, which had always been attributed to American designers at that time. Marc continued to reference men's tailoring with this beautiful wool coat that had a very military cut, but Bohan utilized the pockets, buttons, and collar as a way to bring femininity to the garment. Bohan also introduced menswear to the House of Dior, and he was the original birther of Dior Homme. Essentially, Bohan had realized that there was beginning to be a hint of interest in fashion from men. So Bohan and the former director of haute couture for Dior at that time set up a mini boutique inside the 30th Avenue Montaigne store that had items like ties and cufflinks. It did incredibly well, as women at that time were usually buying those accessories for their men. And from there, Dior Homme has become an incredibly powerful branch of the House of Dior. Bohan's spring-summer 1973 was said to be a light and airy experience, and was a return to the formatting and supple nature of Bohan's Dior. This return to simple and elegant fashions brought around by the 1970s was something Bohan appreciated and reveled in. In 1979, Bohan tried out a new style. A predecessor to the still ever popular oversized silhouette, Bohan created masculine jackets and coats that weren't fitted like they had been for years, but instead were quite large with long sleeves, padded shoulders, long hems, and big pockets. It wasn't just a jacket or coat cut to be bigger. It was as if the woman wearing the look had taken the jacket from her brother, father, boyfriend, or husband to borrow and sneakily return. Maybe even a gay best friend, who knows? And note, the two designers famed for their oversized styles, Rei Kawakubo and Yohji Yamamoto, didn't come and show their first collections in Paris till 2 years later. So maybe Bohan was onto something. Then we got into the 1980s. In his first collection for the new decade, Bohan returned to the Marc Bohanisms he was known for: defined shoulders, supple and belted waists, and his classic knee-length hemline. He mixed in his love of tailoring by adding a suit jacket that had low double-breasted buttons, which was quite risque if worn with nothing underneath. For the autumn-winter 1980 collection, he reconvened about his love of metallic threads and embroidery with beautiful caftans embroidered exquisitely. For the spring-summer 1981 collection, the show had moved from the usual salons of 30th Avenue Montaigne to the Hotel de Crillon due to the sheer number of guests expected to attend. If anything, saying Marc expanded the clientele of Dior immensely. While the world was going through a crisis as the Shah of Iran fell and the world experienced another oil glut, Dior's couture business rose by 50%, which, Jesus Christ, where do these bitches get that kind of money? Bohan had been designing at the house for at least 25 years by 1983 and had really become the face of the brand. He had grown the business into almost a $500 million a year business and was beloved by his clients. Bohan could really do no wrong. For his spring-summer 1984 collection, Bohan looked at the Austrian symbolist painter Gustav Klimt, whose famed portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauche I is a great connection between the two artists. Both Klimt and Bohan loved to work with metallics, specifically gold, which could be the reason Bohan was so attracted to the artist's work. The Autumn-Winter 1984 collection also drew inspiration from the artist Jackson Pollock, whose paint splatter technique made him immensely popular. After seeing a Pollock retrospective, Bohan incorporated that paint dripping effect in bright colors that were so famous in the 1980s. Another interesting thing happened in 1984 besides Bohan's artisanal collections. A then young Bernard Arnault was holding a somewhat hostile takeover of some of France's biggest luxury brands. He utilized his father's fortune to acquire Financier Agaché, which was a luxury good company, and then went on to take control of Boussac Sans Frères. Boussac, for those who remember, was the man who helped Dior start his company, but the parent company of Dior Haute Couture had fallen into disarray. So now Bohan was designing under a new and young businessman who wanted to see Dior become as profitable as possible, if we know anything about Daddy Bernard Arnault today. Luckily, as we mentioned earlier, Bohan wasn't afraid to make Dior more commercial. For the Spring-Summer 1987 collection, which was in fact the 40th anniversary of the New Look collection, Bohan wanted to pay homage to Christian Dior. So he took the style of the New Look and reinterpreted in modern styles, focusing on peplums and tight busts. His Autumn-Winter 1988 collection won him the Golden Thimble Award, which was the award for the best haute couture show of that season. Bohan's final collection for the House of Dior was Spring-Summer 1989, which was inspired by Indian dress. There were sari-style dresses with drapes over one shoulder, which naturally reflect what the West interprets as Indian style. Soon thereafter, it was announced that Gianfranco Ferré, the Italian ready-to-wear wunderkind of that time, would be taking over the brand. It was shocking for many reasons. Firstly, he was an Italian, and he was taking over one of the most famous French fashion houses. On top of that, he had no real background in couture. Thirdly, the Dior Haute Couture clients were in an uproar as they'd come to love commissioning Bohan and getting to know him. He dressed grandmothers, mothers, daughters, and even granddaughters of the same families. It was also said that he was going to retire soon, and Bernard Arnault's decision was upsetting to him personally, as they should have let him bow out gracefully. Karl Lagerfeld, who had not yet at that point began working for Bernard himself, was quoted as saying, "It is not very nice for Marc Bohan, but I think it shows the way Monsieur Arnault works." And there was not a truer statement, as Bernard continues to rule the LVMH group with an iron fist. All in all, with 29 years, 7 months, and 12 days on the job, and with 57 haute couture collections under his belt, as well as expanding the Dior brand, Marc Bohan is the undisputed longest reigning designer at Dior. I would love to know what you guys think of Marc Bohan and his time at Dior. I feel like it's an interesting history and probably one of the most unique experiences for the House of Dior having been had by a designer. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you guys in the next video, and TTYL.